All right. So this is 16.2. And what we went over in 16.1 was really the idea of the media as a linkage institution that connects the citizens to what the politicians in control of the government are doing. And so what we went into was sort of how the media politics has developed over time. First and foremost, we kind of focus on like a cozy relationship between the media and FDR with the press conferences, the fireside chats in the 1930s. And then it sort of progresses where we have the development of television. People have televisions in their home. The Vietnam War is really the first war that is covered, brings the war into the home, so to speak. And then really the TV, the broadcast media has changed over time as well, where we now see this narrowcasting where it's minute by minute updates. It's not super substantive type of reporting. It's not the in depth investigative journalism of the past. And along those lines, too, with the 24-hour media, we see an increase in talk radio. We also see an increase in internet use. And so, even the traditional New York Times, Washington Post hierarchy of newspapers are now moving towards more digital, and we see sort of the potential of the internet to inform citizens. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, 16.1. So now we're going to get into how the news is reported, the media portrays the news, which also includes the bias and how the media can shape public opinion. So when you're finding the news, one sort of credible source or traditional source of media, I suppose, is more accurate is a beat. And so beats, for example, will cover a very specific component of politics, and they will serve that role um, every single day. So what you see here in this picture are the White House beats. And so each of these individuals works for a different media outlet, and their sole responsibility is to cover the press conference that is held every day, in the White House. And so when you talk about this, it could be also Congress, and I mean we even see this in like sports as well. So like a Dodgers beat reporter, they're only covering the Dodgers. Yes, it's baseball, but it's just one thing very specific. This is more like I guess, a trick, so to speak, a tactic that can be used, and this is usually used by politicians. And so, a trial balloon is where you intentionally leak a story, and you're really trying to do initial research. You're trying to see what might be the response to this story, and then see if there may be more grounds to continue with it. Now, we see this a lot with reporters because basically reporters will create relationships with politicians, and so a lot of people will have specific individuals that they will give information to, and oftentimes reporters will not reveal their sources, although it tends to be the similar people. So I think this idea of the media working with politicians, it is in a lot of ways a symbiotic relationship because they both can have mutual benefits towards each other. They can be very adversarial, but oftentimes the media can be a means for a politician to enhance their power, so to speak. Now, as far as how the news is presented, and this is more of how media is today, it's very superficial. This goes back to the narrow casting. It's very specific, not really a lot of in depth stories. It's kind of minute to minute updates. And so, this is really, again, the development over time and perhaps related to attention span and just the idea that the media is trying to make profits. And so, trying to get people to tune in, we see things, these sound bites, and this is something to put a star next to. Sound bites is really what the media comes down to. When they're making those compilation videos of the debates, that's what they're looking for, is sound bites. Clever things, things that can be included in tweets, things that are witty and can drive clicks and things like that. And so we actually see the sound bite is probably less than 10 seconds. It's only maybe a few seconds today, and so that kind of shrinks over time, and I'll show a graphic of that. We see less about talking about the politics, less about the policy. If 2020 is any indication, The policy is not getting a whole lot of discussion. It's more about the actual candidates' personal lives. And as far as the major TV networks, this is more major TV networks tend to be covering like local news. And then, really, if you're talking about politics, you have to tune into now a 24-hour news like Fox, like MSNBC, like CNN. Otherwise, the local news is not necessarily covering national politics the same way. So here's an example, and this is just looking in over 1968 to 2004. So you can even see that the soundbite was closer to a minute, where now it's 7, and I think it might be even like 5 or less than that. And so you can see over time, this is really as far as like uninterrupted time, they're just showing small clips. They won't just show like a 2-minute clip of a candidate talking. It's only small clips, a soundbite. Now, as far as bias is a huge part of the media. I'm going to demonstrate a couple of ways in which bias can be made. But just as far as like a metaphor goes, I want you to kind of imagine like a baseball, right? And you are looking at this baseball, and you need to understand the entire circumference of that shape. The media may only cover one vantage point, and so if you're trying to describe the seams on the baseball, depending on your vantage point, you may have a different understanding of what that is. And so when we're looking at the media, we want to try and corroborate sources, look at as many different outlets as possible, because of the vested interest, because of certain reputation, potential credibility issues. You want to look at it as completely as possible. So one example is there is a bias in favor of one point of view, and in this point, really, I guess I'm more commenting on the idea that there is this belief, a perception that the media is biased in favor of one point of view, and it tends to be liberal. And understand that in general, and this is, I suppose, more local news. When you're talking about factual reporting of the news, it perhaps is different if you're tuning into a network like CNN and Fox News, which is really narrowcasting to appeal to the Democrats or to appeal to Republican voters. And so when you're talking about reporting the news, could be different than the analysis, the talking heads, and things like that. But I will get into sort of the left bias. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but I will get into that as well. Now, when you talk about the vested interest of the media, they are trying to draw in the largest audience, because the largest audience gets the most potential to bring in advertising. And advertisements cost more money, more people tune in. And so networks can charge more money for advertisements. And so it's not what am I trying to say? The interest is not necessarily in reporting the news in the most unbiased way. It's more about reporting it in a way that will draw in the largest audience, and that will increase advertisement revenues, which will increase profits, and that unfortunately is the vested interest. And that's why if you're doing research for like a research study, media, maybe for context, but media is not necessarily a good source to use because of that vested interest. It's different than a peer-reviewed article in a well-respected journal. So here's, like I said, with the perception, and to a great degree, many Americans feel that there is a bias in the news media, and it tends to be more of a liberal bias. And so this is kind of what you're seeing over time, and really I think the most significant is a great deal is increasing. People feel that there is a great degree of political bias. Okay. Now, as far as it being more liberal, what's interesting, and this is more the dichotomy, is the idea that the reporters, the people who are actually delivering the news, tend to be very liberal. Whereas the individuals that own the chains, that own CBS and NBC, they tend to be very conservative, wealthy individuals. And so that's kind of an interesting thing within the media. I think, too, when you look at this, it's a lot of it is about the financial incentive. So, for example, if you're a billionaire and you're going to portray the media in a way that is different than your core values, but it means you make money, perhaps that is what is happening. And so it's really about the financial incentives here. Now, I put like with the fake news, you always want to be careful too. Like this is just a website where you can make your own like fake headlines and upload pictures and things like that. So do be careful. But as far as reporting the news, it's called the fair and balanced, the FCC fairness doctrine, and this is something that has existed really in the 20th century and going into the I guess less into the 21st century. But essentially, what happened is we have where you have to cover any issue you cover. You have to have a conservative pundit on, and you have to have a liberal pundit on, and you have to give the exact amount of time to the liberal pundit as you do to the conservative pundit. Now, this is something that the FCC, as I mentioned before, is the Federal Communications Commission. They're the ones that deal with the content. They're the ones that make sure there's no monopolies. So as far as the content, has to be fair, has to be balanced when reporting the news. This would be different if it were an entertainment network. And so, for example, Fox News Network is not technically classified as a news network. It is an entertainment network. And so that being said, they don't have to follow the same regulations as far as putting information out there. So think of like something like Tucker Carlson. It's not, I mean, he may provide information and insight into politics, but if anything, if he stretches the truth, there's no harm, no foul, because it is kind of almost like a Daily Show. Now, the Daily Show is more insulting, but the idea is that it is more entertainment, and so the idea of providing fair and balanced is not necessarily something that is required. Now, you take that and then you compound that with the idea that the FCC fairness doctrine has been overturned. So it's something that has been reversed by Congress. Under the Reagan administration, a Democratic Congress tried to bring it back, and it was vetoed. And so as far as providing fair and balanced, it really, getting rid of this is not necessarily a benefit for conservatives or liberals. It's, I suppose, a benefit for making money. And so if you do not want to provide fair and balanced, you don't need to. And so that really splits the lane into liberal people watch CNN and they don't question it, anything they hear, and then conservative people watch Fox News and then they don't question it. And so this is kind of what we see as far as changing with the presentation of the media. Now I'm going to talk about omission, which is a big part of this too. Television, especially, because so many people, especially local news, and a lot of conservative individuals own local news networks. Television has a big impact on the public opinion. And so the way things are covered can perhaps have a larger impact than anything else. And so two key words that you'll want to write down and be able to differentiate is agenda setting compared to issue framing. So agenda setting is deciding what to cover. So yes, we will cover Hunter Biden, or no, we will not cover Hunter Biden. That is the agenda setting effect. So by omitting something, while it may not necessarily lend credence to whether or not it's credible, the idea that it is not being covered does have an impact on public opinion. So that's the agenda setting, whether or not you cover something, versus issue framing. This is more of the conservative liberal bias. Issue framing is how you present this loaded wording. So like I remember in 2016, there was a Trump inauguration concert, and then there was like a counter protest concert, and Lady Gaga was at the counter protest inauguration concert, and she said F you, Mr. President, and all this stuff, and CNN covered it like she is like an American hero, and Fox News, I think, covered it more in a realistic light than, I guess, American hero pathos. But the idea is that same story, covered in a different way. So going back to that idea of that baseball, don't let the media let you understand that this is what a baseball looks like, this is what the seams look like. No, you need to do the research to look at it in every which way to get a fuller picture, because the media has bias, they have a vested interest, and it's on you as the informed citizen to do the research and to corroborate sources and to look around. So the other thing that we see is, and this I think goes back to how this 2020 campaign has been held, is the media influences the criteria by which public evaluates political leaders. And so if the media covers something, the public will be more likely to follow that because the media decides to cover it. Oh, it must be important, or oh, the media is not covering it. It may not be important, and that can be very tricky. The other thing is that they can decide how much coverage to give something, and that in and of itself, can also help portray a particular bias. So impacting the public opinion, oh, well, this is not getting a whole lot of coverage, if any, compared to no coverage compared to a lot of coverage. And who decides what gets covered? The media. And who decides how it gets covered? The media. And why do they make the decisions that they do? Well, they have a vested interest. They're trying to make money. They're trying to bring in the largest audience. And so the truth, perhaps, is important, but perhaps making money is the higher priority in this case. Okay. So this is what I was getting at a little bit with the policy agenda, is public officials have their own agendas, but ultimately, too, the media has their own agenda as well. And so while the media is trying to make money, politicians also understand that what the media may cover and what the media may want to cover is perhaps what the politicians should be talking about. And so, like this, the issues that attract the serious attention of public officials is really, this is what they want to cover. So I guess in this election, it would be things like healthcare. It would be things like COVID response. It would be things like dealing with, fracking and environmental policy. That is a part of the policy agenda, and the media will cover a certain amount of time with those ideas. Now, the other thing we see with setting the agenda and covering the media is these entrepreneurs. So like Ralph Nader would be an example of a policy entrepreneur. So he was definitely in favor of like minimum wage reform and environmental protection. And so usually someone can kind of invest their credibility. I think Bernie Sanders or the former Ted Kennedy for healthcare would be good examples of this. And really, they kind of stake their reputation on a particular issue. I think Rand Paul and very specific privacy issues, libertarian issues, is a good example of a policy entrepreneur as well. Okay. So as far as the government goes, the government can be held accountable to a certain degree by the media. And we call that the watchdog role of the media. And so what you would say is that the media prevents the government from straying too far from their constitutional duties or their constitutional powers. And so understand that if especially things like presidents, if they present something that is potentially unpopular, the media will be right there to call them out on it. And so a good example of this is, the covering of Watergate and the covering specifically of the Monica Lewinsky scandal with Bill Clinton. I mean, those are just, a couple examples. But the idea, too, is that if the media sees a problem, it could force politicians to respond. And so this is something like an expose and perhaps not necessarily effective, but in the New York Times publishing an expose about President Trump's tax returns and things of that nature, they are attempting to get the politician to respond to that. And they are largely serving as their watchdog role. And on the inverse, you could say that the media is biased in favor of Joe Biden and does not choose to assert its watchdog role in other cases. All right. Now, as far as the individual, when candidates run, they need to have this sort of mass appeal. And perhaps the reason why Hillary Clinton, as qualified on paper as her credentials were, wasn't particularly appealing as far as Democrats staying home rather than voting in 2016. And so the other thing that is found is just it's more effective in trying to run a campaign and trying to gain control and get coverage and things like that. Is really, it's easier to cover one person. This is also why the presidency is covered in much more in-depth manner than other like congressional races. And so a lot of this is the media is going to try and bring in the largest audience, and you would be much more interested in the president than perhaps the courts and things like that. Now, as far as democracy, information is key to a democracy. And I think a larger debate at hand is the role of social media in information as a fuel to democracy. What do we do with misinformation? How does a company like Facebook actually adequately decipher information for 2 billion people? I don't know if anyone is actually qualified to do that. And so what do we do with that? How do we make sure that information is given and that people can make informed decisions? And while the internet has a lot of benefits, there can be a lot of misinformation out there as well. The other thing that perhaps is an issue too is media is not necessarily presented in stories that are uninteresting. They're trying to bring in an audience, so they may not cover something that is needed to be covered. I think recently, like conflict in Armenia and in the Middle East, is not necessarily getting coverage, but that's because a lot of people tune into news, and it has to have some sort of like entertainment engagement value. And so profit, ratings, bring in money, bring in higher advertisements, bring in more money. And so it's really, this is the vested interest of the media. It is a business. People want to consume specific things. And so going back to the concept of narrowcasting, this is how the news is broken, is fast, small facts, very quickly, minute-to-minute updates, not a whole lot of great in-depth analysis, and people who watch CNN hear what they want to hear, and then people who watch Fox News hear what they want to hear, and the confirmation bias, unfortunately, is very strong. So be decisive and be judicious about looking at different sources. Couple final things, and this is more just a term related, I think, more towards the president. And I think because our current president, demonstrates this so effectively, is the bully pulpit is the idea of going back to the individualism. There is one person. The president is one person, and so when the president speaks, the country listens, is kind of what we look at. And so this was originally coined with Teddy Roosevelt talking in the back of a carriage car here, and even with like Lyndon Johnson, famous for the bully pulpit. And so when we look at the bully pulpit, like I said, it's when the president speaks, the country listens, and I think the tweets of our current president could function as the bully pulpit as well. So just to summarize, when you talk about the media itself, the media can tell people how to feel about political issues. And they can also serve as a watchdog to challenge politicians into responding to certain stories. And so in that regard, they can shape the policy agenda, and also politicians will work with the media to get their policy agenda out, and sort of a media will work with the politicians for their sort of mutual benefit. As far as development of the media, we've seen print media definitely show a decline. So magazines and newspapers, they are becoming more digital, but definitely losing in circulation. Broadcast media, TV and radio, more conservative talk radio has increased. But then broadcast media has gone from Walter Cronkite at 6 p.m. news every hour, or every evening for an hour, going to 24-hour narrowcasting news, to now that we have breaking stories, very small amount of information coming at a time. And really the most important thing I think to understand is that the media itself can link us to the government, but it is on us as individuals to be informed and to understand the vested interest that the media has, and to make sure that we are doing our job to be informed, because the most effective way for a government or a democracy to function is with information, and that goes core to our First Amendment.